Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar on implementing GIS into your school's curriculum. Again, thanks for giving up your time to explore some practical ideas as to how to get GIS going in your classrooms. By way of quick introduction, my name is Jake Lovejoy. I'm the Education Program Manager at Esri Australia and will be presenting today's webinar. A bit of background on me. Prior to working at Esri Australia, I was, and I guess I still am, a registered teacher in Queensland. My teaching experiences include teaching senior modern and senior ancient history, junior geography, and English. I see that we have quite a few attendees today. I do want to mention that this webinar was initially designed to aid schools that are new to GIS with some direction as to how to get started with GIS in the geography curriculum. This particular webinar is a part of our onboarding program. In saying that, we will be exploring practical examples on how to implement GIS into the classroom in practical ways. So even if you are a bit more of an experienced user, hopefully you still get something out of it. And before we get started, as always, I just want to let you know that we are recording today's webinar and it will be made available later on the school's website. And you can access it there maybe by Thursday or Friday, I would say. Throughout the webinar, I should say, welcome your questions. You can submit them in the GoToWebinar panel on the right-hand side at any time during the presentation. And I've got a couple of places throughout the presentation where I'm happy to pause and kind of address any questions that have come up so far, but we'll also have some question time at the end too. So without further ado, we will head on over to today's presentation. And I thought, since we're looking at how to implement GIS into the school's curriculum, I thought I'd move away from the PowerPoint and we would actually make use of Esri Australia's software and would have a look at it through a story map, which I think will pay dividends as we go through it. So the agenda for today's webinar. We'll look at how the use of GIS is outlined in curriculum standards. And I think that's an important place to start because I know as teachers we're often time poor and sometimes the best solution is the easiest solution. However, we do need to recognize that geospatial technologies is a part of the curriculum and we need to be doing it. We'll look at some specific and practical examples as to how to use Arcgis and the applications in the junior years, as well as then the senior years. Like I mentioned, question time will exist throughout. And if you wanted to, I guess, save this story map for a little bit of later viewing, you can copy down this URL and this will take you to this presentation in this story map. So you can actually view that at any time you would like, and I guess refer to it in the future if you do need some ideas or a sounding board. Alrighty, jumping into it. What does the Australian curriculum say about using geospatial technologies? It essentially mandates that students are exposed to and use GIS technology in the classes, and this is actually evident from Year 7. After looking up the Australian curriculum under the geographical inquiry and skills strand, I've pulled out a couple of examples for us to read. So students will represent spatial distribution of geographical phenomena by constructing special purpose maps that conform to cartographic conventions using spatial technologies as appropriate. Another example, under the interpreting, analyzing, and concluding, students will interpret geographical data and other information using qualitative and quantitative methods and digital and spatial technologies as appropriate to identify and propose explanations for spatial distributions, patterns, and trends, and infer relationships. So right off the bat here, we can see that the use of geospatial technologies is specified in the Australian curriculum. And I want to draw attention to these two words that follow spatial technologies, and that's as appropriate. Now, I guess that's a little get out of jail free clause, if you will, for teachers, in that we have a sense of a level of freedom, I should say, in how we use spatial technologies in the classroom. It's not asking us to necessarily integrate them into every single thing that we're doing. It doesn't necessarily have to be evident in every single assessment piece or lesson that we present. It does allow us some freedom in that we can use it flexibly. But the way that I take that phrase as appropriate to mean is that we need to be doing it in some manner or some format. So I thought it worthy to address those two words there, and that's my personal interpretation of the curriculum. You might have something else, and I would say that there are probably teachers in this chat that are in this webinar that are a lot more experienced than I am. So again, take heed of your own judgment. That's just my interpretation, but I think it's important to note that just because it says as appropriate doesn't mean we can get away with not doing it. I think that we just need to be smart about how we are doing it, especially in those junior years too. What does the senior geography syllabuses say about this? I'll begin by specifying that each state has its own syllabus, and I have not gone through all 6 states to pull out a specific example. I've gone through the Queensland syllabus as well as the Victorian syllabus. I'm a Queensland teacher, so I guess my knowledge is a little bit more familiar when it comes to the Queensland syllabus. However, I'm sure that, well, I'm not sure, I'm certain that every state has some specification as to geospatial technologies being used, and that's spelled out in the syllabus. So if we look at a little excerpt from the QCAA, this is what they have to say about using geospatial technologies. So students will use spatial technologies to create and annotate maps at an appropriate scale using area, color, shading, symbols for a specific purpose. Students will use data, so primary data, including data collected from the field, to create maps and map layers using spatial technologies. And students will use spatial technologies to analyze map layers, overlays, in order to determine spatial relationships. And you can notice that it's mandated in all 4 units. So there isn't, I guess, any unit, any term of their senior schooling where they're not in some way or some shape engaging with geospatial technology. And I'd probably point out that a lot of this would come in during an assessment phase too. If we have a look at some of the subject matter found in the Queensland syllabus, this was for one particular unit, looks like it's hazard zones, that unit. Students will recognize hazard zones, represent these on a map using spatial technologies, and analyze the spatial distribution of the hazard. If we look further down, students will manipulate, adapt, and transform data using spatial technologies and ICT technologies to represent and describe the nature, extent, and characteristics of hazard zones. So it's specified not just in, I guess, general unit outlines, but also in the subject matter of specific units themselves. If we jump to the Victorian syllabus, again, we can see that it's required in all 4 units, and that this particular excerpt is about geographic information systems and overlays. Students will create simple layers of data on a map or diagram. They will use layers or overlays to illustrate and assist with analysis and spatial relationships, and they will manipulate the interface of a GIS platform in use. So in other words, they will view the data at different scales. They will add and remove feature layers. They can hide, they can view data layers to identify those relationships. So we see immediately that geospatial technologies is an integral part of both junior and senior curriculum, and therefore as teachers we do need to be aware of that moving forward. And I'm also very aware that many teachers are in the process of moving to geospatial technologies, and I'm not here to, I guess, call anybody out or persecute anyone, if you will. I'll be the first to admit that in my previous school, especially we didn't offer senior geography, but in the junior grades, we were still very much on using things like PowerPoint and paper maps and whatnot. So I just want to clarify that every school's on a journey. And I guess it would be easier for me to say, hey, make the jump now to geospatial technologies because I'm no longer in teaching. But the reality is that many schools are in that process right now. So I guess, yeah, just take it one step at a time and just be aware that, hey, the curriculum does say it, and we do need to look towards moving in that direction. I will kind of top what I just said off with this. The added advantages of using GIS in your classrooms, it is the way of the present and the future. You know, gone are the days of Refidexes and paper maps, street maps. We're using digital maps all the time now, even if it's as simple as looking up a destination in iPhone Maps or Google Maps. It is the way of the present and the future. It's used in almost every industry, and I'll just show you really quickly. I'm just hovering over the industries tab on the Esri Australia website, and you can see that maybe it's not as much as a surprise as it is to you as it was to me. Sorry, but I was a little bit blown away when I looked at how many different types of industries are making use of geospatial technologies. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, we had the Australian GIS user conference, and I listened in on how the New York State Police were using geospatial technologies to map crime around their city, and just things like that. You know, law enforcement is using it. I looked up my street that I live in the other day to look at crime rates on my street, and they're using geospatial technologies to map crimes to specific houses and residents and things like that. So it's being used in a crazy amount of different types of industries. And my last point, I guess, on this is it provides the potential opportunity to reinforce academic rigor and spark interest in the subject of geography. I know that many schools do not offer geography past year 10. Some aren't even offering it past year 9, and year 9 and 10 it ends in year 8. And there is that, I guess, fear that the subject is on its way out. Like a lot of other humanities subjects, especially in smaller schools, humanities subjects can struggle a little bit when it gets to senior, and making sure that we are attracting students with something that's a relevant subject that could potentially build towards the future, their future, and the direction they want to take with their career. And the use of geospatial technologies is going to help that, not only in, I guess, changing their perspective of a subject. You know, it becomes more of a scientific, robust subject, but it also offers some skills that they can utilize if they do pursue a career in the space of geography or environment or something like that. So using GIS in year 7, we'll start jumping into some specific examples for the junior years. It does, again, just to recap, it does specify the use of spatial technologies. It does mention that you can explore things with and without spatial technologies and use them as appropriate. So again, we have that level of freedom. And I think that's important to note when we do, begin looking at it in the senior years. And I'll just jump to, there we go. So I'll set a scene for you, and then I'll begin to present some hopefully useful ideas as to how to implement some GIS-based activities into your classroom. So if your school's anything like mine, your year 7 students, when it comes to IT, were or are essentially useless, if you will. They're called the technological generation. I still think it's a lie. You look at them try and type, and they've got the T-Rex arms out, and they're only using one finger on each hand. You've got issues with IT at the start of the year. students struggling to log in with their computer logins, and then even when they do log in, they're just very slow to get around the software, get around the computer, get around different applications and web browsers, etc. So I'll be the first to admit that. But with that in mind, I guess that would inform my teaching practice as to how I would plan to use GIS, especially in this first unit, Water in the World. So the way I would use GIS with my Year 7 students in particular, it would definitely be teacher-led and explored as a class. So for example, we now have the use of things like an interactive whiteboard, or at the very least a projector that projects our laptop onto a board of some kind. And I would essentially be accessing some of our learning materials, Esri Australia's learning materials that we've created, in order to supplement your unit plans and your lesson plans. So I'm not saying that they replace your unit plans. A lot of our learning materials, especially in Year 7 and 8, are designed to be 20 to 30 minutes long. So it's a really great way to get some digital technology, some engagement in your class, but also keep the content that's relevant to the direction you're heading. I know that, we're all studying water in the world, but the end assessment might always look a little bit different between schools, and that you might need to cover off slightly different things. So with that in mind, I'd encourage you to use this as a tool, an engagement tool, but also a tool to expose them to GIS, but in order to complement your existing resources. So here's one such example, if you will. On this map, this is actually one of our lesson plans, and I've only shown one feature layer from it, but in this particular lesson or learning material, sorry, we explore water in the world, and we explore the different types of water there are, where water might come from, and what forms it might take. So the feature layer that I've got up on the screen right now, as you can see, is actually showing students where all the major aquifers are in the world. So that water that students might not even be aware exists, the water below the ground. I think that in this particular lesson plan, we've also got a feature layer that shows surface water. So you can imagine all the oceans are fairly evident, but your major lakes and your major rivers become evident. There's also another feature layer on here, which shows ice cover change over a 20-year period or something like that. And you can watch how the ice in the Arctic has slowly receded, I guess, over time. So just, I guess, a little bit of an engagement tool to get students thinking about the different types or the different ways water might manifest itself in the world. We've got a couple of lessons on water in the world on our website too. So that would be my suggestion for that first unit you teach. It's very much teacher-led. It doesn't require all the students to log on to their own computers to access the map. You control the pace as you've got the map in front of you on your screen, and you talk to that, and you work through the learning material together as a class. You can print out all the worksheets for them as well, so they can respond in their books or have their own copy too. If we start looking at the second unit, place and livability, and I'm going to keep going with this kind of anecdote I've got going. So the Year 7s, picture it's term 2. I know that many schools operate with geography for half the year, history for the other half of the year. It's term 2 now, and the Year 7s are now settled in. They're on top of their IT and computer logging credentials, if that's ever a thing, but it's a lot better than term 1. And they've acclimatized to the pace of high school, so they kind of know what's expected of them. They're a little bit faster than what they once were. They've realized that we're not holding their hand as much as teachers may have in primary school. They can use, or you could use GIS still as a teacher-led approach, and that would still be my advice most of the time. Still utilizing that interactive whiteboard kind of method, but depending on your class and the makeup of your class, you might actually get them onto their own laptops and working through some of those learning materials via their own laptops instead. And that way they're engaging with the maps we saw above, they're engaging with these kinds of maps themselves, turning layers on and off, and also, I guess, building their own ICT capacities at the same time, but still very much teacher controlled. And if they're not up to independent work, well then, hey, maybe working in pairs, you know, a pair to a laptop or something like that might be an appropriate way to go. I know that, at least in my school, place and livability is usually the unit where we have a fieldwork, or you have a fieldwork component in your assessment. And in my previous school, we did a survey, and it was a paper-based survey. We didn't use geospatial technologies at all. It was a paper-based survey where students would pair up and they would go to a specific location in the school, and they would take data on the people, or the students, sorry, entering that section of the school, how they were using that environment, what seemed to be some environmental and social aspects that were increasing the livability or popularity of that area, and what may have been some environmental and social aspects that were decreasing the livability of that area in the school. If I now knew what I knew about GIS as I did back then, I would have suggested to my head department that there's an opportunity to do the same assessment task essentially, but let's move to a geospatial component and chuck that in there as well. And what we have here, please don't judge it. I did do it in 2 or 3 minutes. I designed a quick survey that was essentially going to explore the environmental and social livability of the school. And students would go out during lunch or whenever they collected their data and use a school-based iPad, or if you've got the rules in place, their own mobile device, and they could go out and collect data on this survey form on their phone or on their iPad. So they could go to the specific point in their school, they could zoom right into that school, so they might actually type in the school to help them out, and then once they found it, they can zoom in closer, they can mark their exact location where they'll be collecting data, and then we get them to answer some questions. So how many pieces of litter are evident in your garden? And I might be asking that question because I'm interested in the environmental factors that might be improving the livability or decreasing the livability of that area. Another environmental based question, give the quality of the soil in the garden a rating. Again, I'm not asking too much of my Year 7 students, but I am asking them to engage with the environment around them, and describe the health of the plant life with regards to the following. So they can look at some of the leaves of the trees and the plants around them, give it a rating, same with the stem and the trunk, same with the roots. Again, a very quick 2-minute survey that I put together, but all of this data that they collected would be mapped to the point that they answered, or that they located when they first submitted their question to answer 1. So that means that all of these subsequent questions are geotagged to this one location. And if you have 25 sets of data, you can begin to see some patterns start to emerge, specifically in areas where students have collected data in the same part of the school's grounds. The great thing about Survey 123 is it'll actually also spit out some basic column, bar, and pie graphs. So if you had 25 sets of data as well, you could view that data in a pie graph to see how many students answered with 1 to 5 as compared to 11 to 15. And hopefully you could, as a teacher, they collect the data, of course, but you as a teacher could then print out some of the graphs that you thought are relevant, maybe the map that had all of their geo points on it, zoomed right into to the school, and you could give that to them to include in their report as well. At this stage, again, as a teacher, I wouldn't get them creating their own survey. You could create that survey and you could share it with your class via a QR code or via a URL. And then once they collect the data, it automatically uploads onto the map for you, and you can distribute that map either digitally to them, or you can simply print a screenshot of that map too. Moving on to GIS in Year 8. Again, let's keep going with the scenario. The Year 8s now understand expectations and the pace of high school. Hopefully they've got that down pat. We're not babying them anymore. They don't have their core class groups that they might have had for maths, science, geography, and history. You know, they're now in random classes all of the time. And knowing the Year 8 geography curriculum, my advice would be to use GIS most of the time to support the teaching of content. Depending on what you focus on in landforms and landscapes unit, you might be able to also use it for some field work, and I'll touch on that in a second. So again, my advice would be to be using some of the learning materials that we've created, maybe some of the maps and story maps you might begin to create to supplement your unit, and use that as a way of exposing them to GIS in the classroom. So how can students make individual use of Esri Australia's learning materials? They can use the worksheets that come with every learning material. The worksheets are instructional. They contain student questions. You might even, they come in a Word document format as well, so you might even actually add some of your own questions in there before you hit print or before you save it and send it off to students via email. Students are then required to access the online resource that goes with the worksheet, and they need to perform the actions on the map themselves. So they need to go to view the legend, they need to click layers on and off, and the worksheet gives them those instructions too. But they're the ones playing around with the map and moving the map around. And of course, you can, depending on your class makeup, might be more suitable to work in pairs. So let's have a look at some of those units, some of the, I guess, learning materials that are available. So this one here is an example of, a map that has the following feature layers. It has the tectonic plates. It also has what kind of movement. So, you know, red being converging, black being transform, blue being diverging. It maps all of the volcanoes, as you can see, as well as mountain ranges. And you can see, if you look at the Himalayas, you can see the mountain range there. That's just part of the topographic map, I guess, not so much a feature layer, although there are feature layers on Arcgis Online that could add that. And we've got a hotspots layer too. So I know that in Year 8, we explored the Hawaiian hotspots and how they were being created, the Hawaiian Islands and how they were being created by a hotspot and the movement of the plates. And our learning material simply takes students through turning different layers on and off at different times, getting them to move the map around, maybe zoom into a certain point, etc. And, you know, playing with the legend. So again, we have a little bit of a legend here as well. And throughout that learning material, we would explore and seek to explain why this Hawaiian Islands chain, if you will, is going off in this northwesterly direction. So that's one example of a learning material that might be of use when it comes to looking at landforms and landscapes. Another super simple one is sometimes you don't even need to add feature layers. You don't even need to add data. Sometimes you might just wish to look at satellite imagery and look at how land use is playing its part in processes like erosion and deposition. So in the preservation or the degradation of coastlines, you can also simply use a map to use virtual measurement tools. So I'll just show you really quickly. It's really simple, but we've got our virtual measurement tools here. I can measure coordinates and lock it in. You can see it's locked in there. I can measure distance from one point to another, and I double click to lock it in, and I can also measure area. So if I wanted to map a particular area of something too, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean we need to be adding feature layers. Sometimes we can just be using some really simple tools, but on a geospatial platform. When I was talking about land use and land cover, this is probably my favorite example. found some imagery from 1955, some satellite imagery, and this is the Gold Coast, the Spit region of the Gold Coast, and you can see all of the sand, all of the beach was there. And then if we move the slider across to 1999, we see that development has started to take place. This sand that was kind of blowing out into the mouth of the river there has been reduced, and that's probably largely because of things like what's it called? The it's escaped me. The sand pumping station, the sand pumping jetty here as well, which pumps sand from the southern side of the beach through to South Stradbroke. And again, from 1997 to 2020 this time, just showing again how land use has changed over time. So a really great and simple tool, and doesn't actually require too much effort to pull up some old satellite imagery in Arcgis and compare the two as well. Moving on to Unit 2, Changing Nations. You can utilize, again, the learning materials that we have to explore things like interstate migration lessons, megacities, push and pull factors. And if we look at this one, we've got the yellow circles represent megacities and the sizes, and the colors on the countries themselves represents GDP. And hopefully we get students going, well, hey, hang on a second. It seems that megacities lie predominantly in regions where the GDP is lower. There is a couple of exceptions, of course, being Japan, some areas in Europe as well. And even though New York and LA, if you will, are first world cities, I guess, their GDP is also not as strong too. But we definitely see a concentration in those lower GDP areas. So again, using those learning materials to explore the ideas, also creating your own maps to suit your own needs is also an option. You know, these are things that I've done based on my knowledge of the curriculum. There's no reason that you as a teacher can't go, okay, great example, but we actually focus on this. I need to build a resource surrounding this particular topic and go off in that direction instead. Again, you can also modify the student worksheets to suit your needs as well. You can use story maps to communicate a topic. So like I'm communicating a topic to you today, it might be that because you are teaching, a lot of Year 8 geography, in my opinion, is content-based. It might be that you build a couple of story maps to communicate that content too. This is what I always say, it's like a PowerPoint, but better. You know, you can actually interact with it. You can put in those videos, pictures, all that kind of stuff. But I guess it's a one-stop shop where you can also interact with data too. I like this narrative storytelling with interactive maps and other media. And I will mention, I talked briefly about the survey being used for the place and livability unit. I know that again, in my experience teaching Year 8 geography, during this unit, we looked at, for one of our assessment pieces, we looked at push and pull factors and how that had influenced migration in our classrooms. So we kind of looked at, I guess, the class makeups of where students came from, where their parents came from, and maybe the reasons why they were pulled to Australia or pushed from their country. I guess survey 123 doesn't necessarily have to have a geotag question attached to it. You might simply design a survey where the first question is, where are you from? Student types in the answer. Where is your mother from? Student types in the answer. Where's your father from? Student types in the answer. And then another couple of questions about why did your parents decide to migrate here, if that's a question, if that's applicable to them. It doesn't necessarily have to be geotagged with a find the appropriate place on the map and log that data there. You can still use the surveys to create those bar and column and pie graphs that give that little bit of analysis to your data. Year 9, geography as a subject begins to become more rigorous. I know, and I mentioned this before, not a lot of schools, particularly in the state system, I should say, at least in Queensland, not a lot of schools are offering it all the time in Year 9 and 10. as I'm sure you're aware, the school curriculum, the amount of subjects every teacher and every subject is fighting for its space on the board. And I know that geography is one of those subjects that usually suffers. But if your school is doing it, that's awesome. Here are some ideas. So how to use spatial technologies, again, learning materials, but I think I've harped on about that a fair bit, and I'll show you where to find them at the end in case you aren't sure. But we do have learning materials for you to use. But I want to point out this second bullet point. The option here, now that we're in Year 9, is to start making use of GIS to support assessment, and that needs to be a bit more of a focus, particularly if you do have a senior geography subject being offered at your school. We need to start building these skills and capabilities in now in Year 9 and 10, so that if they do choose to progress to Year 11 and 12, they've got a foundation of skills and capacity when it comes to using GIS. So how do I use it in a biomes and food security unit where the assessment is an exam? A good question. I found that as a teacher, I can use Arcgis Online to actually go and create maps, and then I can screenshot that map with the legend, or print view that map with the legend, and I've got an exam source that I can use in an exam. So if I was looking at biomes, and I know that there are biome feature layers, I might have a biome feature layer on this map, and I might also have a feature layer showing tree cover loss on the map as well. And I could I guess create a series of questions around that particular source and have that as a source in my exam. The geographies of interconnections unit, and this is where I really see GIS as a potential to be implemented into the assessment. I know that at my school, again, it was a research assignment, and students were required to complete research in a global corporation. So it was sticking very much with, I guess, the suggested assessment that that the Australian curriculum had put forward. So the students completed research on a global corporation approved by the teacher, something like Nike or Samsung, for instance. And I guess the way that I would see implementing GIS into this curriculum is that students actually create their own map that features the factory locations of that particular corporation, maybe the daily wage of textile workers, things like that. And I'll show you an example to explore our Nike map, and this is available as a learning material as well. But you might get students to map where all the Nike stores are, and I'm sure that you can find that data fairly easily online. You can also find out where Nike is making its shoe. So here we've got a symbol of a shoe pop up in the countries that Nike is actually manufacturing the shoe itself. Let me turn this one off for a second. And if I click on these, okay, I can see that in China, the part of the shoe that's being made is synthetic leather, and students can enter that information. In India, polyester, Vietnam, leather, and so forth. Malaysia, the rubber. So they're entering some basic data, but still it informs the audience of, okay, they've done some research about what country is producing what kind of part of the shoe. If we look at this one, this feature layer shows us where Nike factory workers worldwide are located. And again, we start to see a really high concentration of factory workers in Southeast Asia. And there's a fair distribution of factory workers in Europe. And if we again turn making the shoe on, we'll see that there's a little bit of a discrepancy here immediately. This makes sense, but what jobs do these people have? And it's probably more of a distribution role rather than a creation of the product role itself. Students can find information and add information about textile pay rates to the map, and we can see that in China, Chinese textile workers are making $2.65. I'm assuming that's a day, whereas in Australia, textile workers are making $38. Sorry, probably not a day, probably an hour. Now that I think about it, $38 an hour. And again, we see a clear relationship as to why Nike would hire or have more factory workers in these regions, because they don't have to pay them as much. And again, they might find or source some data about countries where child labor in the textile industry exists. And we've got Brazil is a big one over here, but again, lots in Southeast Asia, which explains why there's such a heavy concentration there. And all of a sudden, your students have demonstrated plenty of relationships, but also some anomalies as to why jobs exist in these areas, and that allows them to explore that in their in their evaluation section or analysis section of their assessment piece. And at the end of the day, the hardest part is finding the data. Once the data's there's plenty of resources on our school's website where you can teach students and take students through that process as to how to add data that they found to a map. And the great thing about it is these students might at the end of it decide to present this all in a story map like we're doing right now. And there might not necessarily be that need for a physical copy. You've got a digital copy that you can mark from, and you can actually engage with too. You can click on the layers and find additional information about them. All right, I'll just check the questions box really quickly, and I'll give you maybe 30 seconds or so. If you do have a question, you can chuck it in there. As I know that we've just, I guess, addressed year 7, 8, and 9 and the Australian curriculum fairly quickly. If you did have a question about what we've covered so far, you can ask it. Otherwise, I will continue. Not seeing anything so far, and that's all right. Awesome. I'll continue, and I'll check those questions again and invite you to ask some questions at the end if you do have any. Like we began touching on, we're on the home stretch now as well. Like we began touching on, year 9 and 10 probably more specifically is key in preparing students for senior geography, particularly if they do end up taking that senior subject. As we've specified, the senior syllabus mandates the use of GIS and spatial technology in all 4 units. And I know that, speaking from a Queensland teacher's point of view, I know that one of the criteria actually essentially is all about geospatial technology and the creation of maps and the adding and analysis of data in those maps. And it's going to be really hard for your students to be marked well on that criteria if they're not using geospatial technologies. So the teaching and learning process should incorporate the use of GIS so that students are consistently developing their skills. So it shouldn't necessarily be about an interactive whiteboard where you're teaching to a map that you've created, although that will still definitely probably come up. A lot of the time it's about them creating practice maps or creating practice surveys in preparation or in the lead up to assessment, so they're familiar with the process. It might be that in the lead up to a field report, you actually spend some time, a lesson or two, taking the students through the process of how to create a survey, and spend time brainstorming appropriate questions for them to perhaps include in their survey. Or you might build that survey together, but still it probably needs to be student led, so that you're not essentially doing the assessment for them, and you build the survey based on their recommendations and their design. And then you can always distribute that survey to them for the fieldwork, or when it comes to looking at the map of all the data from the survey, you can actually distribute that map and they can save a copy of that map to their particular account as well, where they can then add data to that map as well. So Unit 1, Environmental Change and Management. The assessment for this unit is usually a field work and a report, field report. And my advice, like we just touched on, is using field apps like Survey 123 and Collector to support data collection in the field. So you can take photos with these apps, you can record data, you can even take additional notes as well, particularly on Collector as well. And again, using Arcgis Online to display that field data, to make notes, to make annotations, to add other feature layers that you might find on the internet to identify relationships or anomalies. Unit 2, Geographies of Interconnections. My understanding that this assessment is a research assignment. You can import sourced location-based data into Arcgis Online. You know, that's things like the ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, or let's have a look at some of my other data sites. World Bank's a good one as well. What these sites give you is, I might actually visit this real quick and show you in case you're unaware of World Bank. You can actually search up a country or search up an indicator. Let's look at electricity. For instance, electric power consumption. And I can actually download this data in a table format, so a CSV or an Excel. It's like an Excel spreadsheet, but it's a CSV spreadsheet. And that's the one that that's the format I want to download it in. And actually, once I've cleaned that data up in that spreadsheet, I can actually bring it into a map and create a choropleth or something similar to this as well. And that's, I guess, the styling of data to identify relationships. So by styling your data into something like a choropleth, or if we recall the megacities example, those big circles versus the smaller circles, they help us to identify relationships, patterns, and anomalies. So there's the potential for that too. And I'm always happy to be a sounding board if you are looking for a way to integrate it into a specific piece of assessment. Of course, you're the expert on your assessment piece, but hopefully I can provide some ideas as to how we can actually get started with putting some of the GIS component into that. Senior geography. And I've combined year 11 and 12 here because teachers, at least in Queensland, are required to design their own assessment pieces. They need to be unique. They need to be endorsed by the Curriculum Assessment and Authority, Queensland Curriculum Assessment and Authority. I think I've missed a letter there, but that's all right. So I'm not going to spend too much time looking at specific assessment examples. I'm going to keep it generic. I will touch on it. Students are if it's necessary that students are continually exposed to GIS in year 9 and 10 in particular, so that they're ready for senior. Short and extended response exams. We touched on how teachers can create their own sources for their own exams. And I'll just show you, if we go to the professional development page of the school's website, there's a tab here called Assessment Support. And I've actually got a little bit of a PDF that explores some of those ideas a bit closer, how to create some stimulus pieces for your exam. And I know that sometimes finding an appropriate map at the appropriate scale, showing the appropriate data, can be such a hard thing sometimes. And being able to just essentially create your own map at the desired scale with custom data goes a long way in helping you to create those exams with appropriate sources. Field reports, again, the use of field applications like Survey 123 or Collector can be used to support the collection and mapping of data. Surveys and maps will need to be designed by teachers and students. I would recommend that if you want a uniform survey or a uniform collector map so that all of the data is the same, then you would produce that survey, but not in isolation. Students would definitely be involved in the design of that survey as well. You might have an exemplar survey that you've got hidden under the table, but to push them in the right direction. But I think that students definitely need to be involved in that process, thinking about how to ask questions. What's the right format for question? Do we want a multiple choice response? Do we need a free text response? Things like that. Arcgis Online can be used to make additional notes and annotations or feature additional layers. So again, they might bring their data in, but then they might want to bring in an extra couple of layers to show those relationships. And if we look at this particular example, the total annual precipitation is the one that's covering the entire continent. And this particular layer, so the circles here, are the confirmed cases of Ebola in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. If I scroll right in, probably pink wasn't the best color to use for the smaller circles now that I have a look at it. But they can add their own data to support identifying some of those relationships, those anomalies that might exist. In this case, this wouldn't be field report data that's collected. This speaks to the data report itself, but it holds true for the field data as well. In the case of a data report, providing that you've cleaned your data and it's in a CSV format, you can import it into Arcgis Online. So this Ebola data, I actually found it through the World Health Organization, I think, and I cleaned it up and made it presentable according to the standards needed in the CSV document, and I actually imported it into this map here. I changed the symbology and the sizing of those dots here. So the larger dots represent more Ebola cases. And again, I can click on that data. It highlights the particular health district I'm talking about, so Katwa. And I've got a confirmed cases 653 here and deaths 495. So I can include the data I want in here and bring it up at will. I've also then, just for demonstrations purposes, have added a feature layer that has already been hosted in ArcGIS Online. So it's one of my favorites, total annual rainfall. I've brought that in, and again, we see a pretty clear relationship that health districts in other areas aren't necessarily coming up with Ebola. The argument could be made that Ebola cases are much more present in places with that high annual rainfall as well. It could be with it doesn't necessarily have to be with rainfall. If you're exploring a population unit, there's population density layers on there. There's not just population density, but population density by age. So specific areas in Melbourne, for instance, might have a higher rate of 20 to 30-year-olds, and other areas might have a higher rate of retirees. That data, believe it or not, does exist, and sometimes a lot of it exists in ArcGIS Online, and all you have to do is type in the search phrase, and you might get lucky and something might pop up. And I'll just show you really quickly. If I click on add in the map, I can either browse Living Atlas or I can search for layers. I want to change this from my content because at the moment it's only exploring things that I've created. And I want to choose ArcGIS Online. And then you can see some of the stuff I've already looked for. But here's that one that we were talking about, population under 15 Australia. Let's give it a search. And I like this one because it's by Esri, so I also know it's reliable data. And shows at a state level. That's not too informative at the moment, but the great thing about this data is that as I scroll in, it changes from state levels to statistical areas, and the closer I go in, the more specific that data comes, as you can see. So really insightful. If I'm looking for, okay, population under 15, I can click on this and for some reason, the Blue Mountains. This area, well, again, I guess a very small sample size in this case. Oh, sorry, there's Siri picking up on something I said. Sample size of 28. Of this, 9 are under the age of 15. So this might not be the best sample, as it's quite a small sample size, but you get the picture. As I scroll in and scroll out, the scale of the data also changes, which is particularly useful. And again, like we've been touching on, it allows students to compare and contrast data with other feature layers so that they can identify patterns and anomalies. And I don't know if you were with us a couple of weeks ago and watched Brett Dascombe present, but the great thing about it is you might be able to, your students can actually present their data, present their field report, present their data report or their assessment in a story map like this. And that way they can speak to the data on the side whilst you can engage with it on the right. And I guess I would say the biggest obstacle to that is getting it past the endorsement process or the panel process or the confirmation process where you send your student assessment out to somebody to check that your gradings have been accurate. But my argument is, and I know that Brett's been successful with this with the QCAA in Queensland, that if the QCAA or your state is mandating the use of geospatial technologies, then they need to also be ready to accept student assessment in this format too, even if it is just a link to the URL, and then they can engage with it themselves. But the great thing about this is that I can actually print that story map too, and I'll right click this to give you an example. So even if they're not accepting the electronic submission, it does give you a bit of a printout version that students could submit as their final presentation or their final assessment piece as well. Evidently it's not as pretty and you don't have the interaction anymore. They might need to take additional screenshots of things like the legend as well and put the legend in, but you can build that assessment piece into a story map and print that too. So in closing, I will just return to the PowerPoint for a second. Bear with me while I find it. I guess now's a good time to remind you that if you do have a question, please do enter it now as I do wrap up. And you can do that by clicking in the little question box in the GoToWebinar panel. And I'm happy to answer them. And whilst I wait for some questions to come through, if there are any, my biggest advice would be, if you haven't already, and this really, honestly, this is not to toot my own horn whatsoever, but bookmark this education website. It's got plenty of professional development resources on there, things like how to engage with Survey 123 or Collector, how to add layers, or how to prepare your data in that CSV spreadsheet. So a lot of PD there. Yes, it says for teachers and students, you might upskill yourself and then teach your students, but you might also set some of these videos for homework for them to engage with in the lead up to an assessment piece. And again, another reason that I encourage the bookmarking of this website is we've got our learning materials. You can search by year level, you can search by 3 subjects, and also some skills PDFs, skills guides for students and teachers. And I think I forgot to mention that at the bottom of this PD page, we've also got things like our webinars as well. So a good place to keep an eye out for free professional development opportunities too. Again, if you wanted to save the story map, there's the URL. Otherwise, there's only been one question, and that's all right with me. Means we can all get out on time. What's the best source for a crash course in Survey 123? Awesome, thanks, Ruth. Yeah, I would say that it's definitely visiting the PD page. Survey 123. It's a two-part process, if you will. These videos are only about 15 to 20 minutes long. So how to create and design your own survey and how to analyze your Survey 123 results. And if you don't like watching a video, there's the PDF guide as well that takes you step by step. My plan for next year, especially in term 1, is to run a bit of a field apps webinar series where we'll look at Survey 123 in the first week, and then something like Collector or Quick Capture in the second week. Just make it a really short and sharp series, but I've definitely identified that that's a need that teachers are very interested in learning more about. So yeah, keep an eye out next year, term 1. I'll definitely be looking to have a bit of a field apps webinar series, and that'll be less about talking about a quick overview of Survey 123 like I did today, and actually going through the process of creating one and designing one, and then actually getting my webinar attendees to essentially fill out that survey, and then we can analyze those results together as a group too. So keep an eye out for that. Otherwise, I don't see any other questions that have come through today, and that's fine. You can, I'm not big on self-promotion, so please ignore the image that I found of myself. If you do want to connect on LinkedIn, again, when this recording becomes available, you can type in that URL and connect with me, where I will post those webinar opportunities moving forward. And if you do need or were after some more specific one-on-one support, please feel free to email me at education@esriaustralia.com.au. I'm more than happy to help. In fact, it's the most favorite part of my job. The corporate side is definitely not my favorite part. I definitely am still very much a teacher, and please save me from the corporate side. Other than that, I will remind you very quickly that we do have one more webinar this week. It'll be presented by Joseph Kirsky. So he's a world-renowned geographer, but he's also essentially he's in the same position as I am in at Esri, but he works for the United States Esri, but he is exploring how to enable students to become community change agents with GIS. So again, that's available on that professional development page of the website. I encourage you to register if you haven't. I'm sure that I myself am going to learn stuff from Joseph. He's pretty incredible and super enthusiastic about it all. So yeah, I'd encourage you to do that. Otherwise, again, a recording will be available later this week. And if you do need that help, reach out. That's it from me today. Thank you for joining me today. Thank you for giving up your time and term 4. I really do appreciate it. And I'll look forward to hearing from you if you do have a query or question that comes my way. Alrighty, guys, have a good afternoon.